A very warm welcome to Fireside Chats. My name is Magela Pillai, and today I'd like to introduce you to Sister Denise, who has been practicing Rajyoga Meditation for over 40 years. Today we will be looking at the subject of being an instrument. In this show, we look at a variety of topics surrounding the subject of spirituality. We ask you, the viewer, to take a good look into your heart and ask yourself some serious questions like whether you are happy, whether your internal world is balanced with your external world, and whether you enjoy a deep and meaningful relationship with God, whomever you believe him or her to be. Sister Denise, a very warm welcome to today's show.
Thank you.
Being an instrument, what on earth does that mean? What are you an instrument of?
Well, the idea is to be an instrument of God. And this is not a new idea. You'll find it in the various different religions, the idea of being an instrument for the task of God. I think a lot of the people who want to really develop their spiritual life to a high degree, those who are mystics and so on, they generally will address God asking to be used as an instrument. And if you are an instrument of God, what happens? What goes on in such a situation? I mean, the most intense form of instrument is if God will use your body, your mind, your eyes, your mouth, and communicate to the world through you. And God is absolutely capable of doing that. God is not a human soul and doesn't have a body of his own, which means that if God wants to do something somewhere for any reason, and there is someone who is open to be used as an instrument, then in an instant God can use that person's eyes, mouth, body to cause someone who needs to be served to receive that service, that experience, that help. That can be done. Then there's something much simpler, because God, God can touch your mind, and you can get a thought that I should say this, or I should do this, or I should go here, and then maybe at that time you don't really think that God is using you because it's very, very subtle. But quite possibly in hindsight, you will look back and say, now that wasn't possible. I don't know how to do that. I don't speak like that normally. How did that happen? And those who are, studying Raj Yoga and practicing spirituality, they will be very aware that this is a possibility. And so to say, yeah, looks like God used me for something. Then there are other occasions where, God can use you as an instrument and you'll be completely unaware. And then the worst thing is God uses you to do something extraordinary and you take the credit. If you're really honest, you would have to say, no, I can't do that. I think there's an interesting test, and that is, okay, if you did it, let's see you do it again. And you can't. So if you can't reproduce it, it means, okay, definitely it happened, but God worked through you on some level, because if you did it, then you can reproduce it.
Okay. Sister Denise, how does one become an instrument of God? Because I think that serves a very high purpose, a very noble purpose.
Well, yes, it does. And I think that, God knows all the people in the world. And God knows the competency, the orientation, the history, the intention of all the souls of the world. And there are some souls who will address God in their prayers, in their internal conversations, in their meditations, and who will request that God, I'm available, use me, please use me. In whatever way you want, I'm ready. And you see instances of this through history, especially the religious history, different saints, different prophets, something like this. And there's, it's I think part of the belief system of many of the conventional religions that this is something that God can do because God is discarnate. And so the question of God getting something done through someone is definitely a concept that is known, you know. And so you say, okay, well, you know, I would like to be used. And why would you want to be used is because you feel that nobility, you feel, well, that is the highest thing that I can, you know, exist for, is to be an instrument of God. You have this wonderful prayer of Saint Francis that's very, very famous, in which he's requesting to be an instrument for God's peace. And many people who find themselves with tasks, say to be mediators or to do something which is very beneficial, humanitarian, they will invoke God to try to bring God into it. And it can happen that it gets done, and the person who's the instrument really has a hard time seeing how could this happen. And that's also another indicator that, yes, it is indeed beyond your capacity. So there's definitely some divine help going on. But God works in mysterious ways. This is well known. And God can work directly and indirectly. Now, if you are an instrument of God, you will get what he calls a commission. Just as if you are an instrument for buying and selling property or something, you get a commission. So it's all to do with karma. And I think that the person who desires to be an instrument of God, who wants God to work through them, it's really because they want to have a direct karma with God. You want to work with God, you want to do things for God. Of course, God doesn't need anything, but if you help in God's task, then there is that karma with God. Now, when you have a karma with a human being, it's one-to-one. When you have a karma with God, you do one, and God will give you the return, you know, multi-million times over. But of course, that is deferred to the future, your future births or whatever. So don't look for any rewards now. Even the contrary can happen, that, okay, you say to God, I want to be your instrument, and God says, well, you up for this? Because if you become my instrument, then you're going to be operating differently from the other people. And what God wants to do in this world is not necessarily what the people want, because God's task is very different from what people generally want to do. You know, God's task is to take the world as it is now and completely transform it into something that corresponds to all the different attributes and qualities of God. So that's very different.
What does one need to cultivate within one's own personality so that God will feel free to use you? Because he doesn't just use anybody, he chooses whom he uses.
Of course. Well, there has to be absolute humility. And I think also you have to be strong, because God can put you in awkward situations where people will not necessarily understand what's going on. And maybe God wants to do something through you, and people may not like you for it or something like this. So I think, dedication, strength, humility, and I think you also have to be empty, because you don't want to get in the way.
Empty meaning?
Empty is like you become like a conduit, so you don't interfere.
Oh, you don't have your own agenda.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, that type of empty. Okay, what else?
And I think you have to keep yourself ready. An instrument, like if you're a virtuoso violinist and you have a Stradivarius violin, then that's a good violin. So the instrument has to make sure that I am in order. That means you have to make sure that my yoga is up to the level, my studies up to the level, my karma is correct. I have to be usable as an instrument, because I think also the instrument becomes also an example or a sample, you see. Because if God will work through you, then you become visible. You might become a target, but definitely people start looking at you. And so it's very important to be able to, reflect things about God and to have your own separate individuality more merged, so that whatever God wants to show through you, there's nothing in the way of that. So you make yourself pliable, because a soul uses a body. You express yourself through your face. You express yourself. So if God is going to use you as an instrument, your own soul has to sort of sit down in the background and say, okay, this body is usable, you use it however you want, and not get in the way.
Denise, that all sounds extremely noble, but we are human. You stated in a previous episode, we've reached our weakest point because the battery is bleeping, we have need, we're empty, we're spiritually depleted, and so which leaves us with our dark side that we have to deal with by ourselves. How do you balance being an instrument of God with being a fallible human being? And everyone's different, but everyone has a dark side.
I think this is why the humility is important, because, God might use you once or twice in your lifetime. It's not necessarily an everyday thing. And so, okay, maybe you feel, or somebody feels, okay, God used you, but then the rest of the time not. So you can't sort of run on the basis of one time God used you. That any kind of pride or ego that might arise in connection with that, that's your dark side, you see, and that will sort of negate any benefit that you could have accrued by being honored in that way, So I think that God will use people who are really working on themselves and who are really absorbing the light of God, because that light keeps your dark side illuminated so that it doesn't take over from the light.
Okay. Yes, Denise, God is the omnipotent one. Why does he need instruments in the first place? Why can't he just do his work without instrumentation?
He says, yeah, I can do it, but it's so much nicer to do it with you.
Oh, that's a nice answer. But is that the only reason?
Yeah, because you see, the purpose of God is to get his children, to offer his children the opportunity to do something great. And so, God will not do something by himself, partly because God doesn't receive the fruit of karma. So when God does something through others, then those people receive the fruit of the karma of making themselves available as instruments.
Okay, that's quite a loaded term. God does not receive the fruit of karma. Explain that to us.
One of the titles of God is Akarta, Asochta, Abhokta in Hindi. So Akarta means he doesn't do anything. Asochta means he doesn't think anything. And Abhokta means he doesn't receive the fruit of anything. So we human souls...
Okay, so that means as far as the law of karma is concerned, God is forever neutral.
God is forever neutral, and in order for God to do something, it's not that he will do something directly, he gets things done through others.
There's another word for that, isn't there? There's that word.
Karan Karavanhar.
Yes. Not too familiar with the lingo.
Right.
What does that mean? Say that again, sorry. What does that mean?
Karan Karavanhar. It means God gets things done and gets things done through others. So God can give you visions. That's direct. God can touch your mind with a thought. That's direct. But when it comes to talking and doing physical actions, a body is required for that. And so God will use the body of another for speaking, because you can't talk if you don't have a mouth. You can't hear anything if you don't have ears. So, if you want to talk to God, you don't use a loud voice, you send a thought, because God receives thoughts.
There are not many who know that, because many opt for the loud voice. Sometimes the thought is, the louder the voice, the better the chance of being heard by the divine.
Well, there are some people who say God must be deaf, because I've been talking to him for so much time he's not listening, and then they start really getting strong about it. And that is because God responds very discreetly and when the time comes. And so the devotees sometimes can get very impatient.
Mm-hmm. So, Denise, in terms of these three titles that you just mentioned about
Asochta, Akarta, Abhokta.
Yes. How do those qualities relate to the instrument then?
Well, the main thing is that those are statements about God that you find in the religious literature, and so they need to be interpreted. Because asochta means God doesn't think. Well, when a human being thinks, a lot of the time a thought doesn't become a practical reality. But if God has a thought, it immediately becomes a practical reality. There's no gap. There's no reflection. There's no, oh, well, shall I do this? Shall I not do this? Or how should I do this? And God is completely different from a human being in that way. And then akarta is not to do action through a body. So action gets done through the body of another, you see. And then abhokta, because God doesn't change and God doesn't do any direct action, so there's no consequences. So that's why instruments are quite important, because if there is an instrument, then God can get things done through that instrument. Generally speaking, it's not just one instrument. God will use a variety of instruments for different things. If you're a carpenter, you have your hammer for one thing, a screwdriver for something, your chisel for something. And so different ones of us may be different tools in the toolkit of God, depending on the characteristics of the person and their usefulness for what God wants to get done, as well as their availability.
Okay. Now, Sister Denise, in terms of the work God does, choosing his instruments, does that mean that he is always aware of what is going on earth, all across the globe?
Yeah. God is fast, very, very fast. It takes a nanosecond for God to check. God can go and visit we meditate at 4 o'clock in the morning, and God will visit all the people who meditate at 4 o'clock in the morning before 4:01. Anywhere in the world. That means very fast, you see, because the speed of thought is instant, and God is not in any way slowed down by ordinary thought, waste thought,
traffic,
anything, any kind of funny stuff going on in the head. There's no garbage in the mind of God. Everything is absolutely clear. It's a very different being.
Sister Denise, there are people who conduct themselves in a way that shocks humanity because of its darkness. And many who really believe in God, love God, have God in their lives on various levels, ask the question, why doesn't God intervene in such situations? Why doesn't He send His instruments to sort things out there? Why does God not intervene? What would be, yes, as far as His instruments are concerned, why is He not using His power in those situations?
Well, He is, but maybe not in the way that those people want Him to. God doesn't take orders from humans.
Okay, that is news to many, because there are many who believe that He does not necessarily take orders, but answer a call.
Yeah, God will definitely answer a call and answer a request, but not take orders.
Okay, so
whenever somebody says, why doesn't God something, God will say, well, my dear child, you don't understand very much, do you? You don't know what I'm doing. So, people presume a great deal. They don't know what is God doing. And God does a great deal to relieve. And even one of the functions of the instruments is to orient their minds so that the power of God can be captured and directed where it's needed, because there are many places you can't go. It's too dangerous, war zones, torture chambers, whatever. We have to direct the light of God and relieve the distress of those who are in those conditions.
Okay. Sister Denise, why does He act in secrecy? Why does He not make all of what you just said known, so that there could be less confusion about who He is and what He is? Why the cloak and dagger?
I don't know that there's much in the way of a dagger.
Okay, fine. Sorry. Why the cloak? Why the veil of secrecy?
Well, it is in the nature of God to be extremely invisible and difficult to discern, because there is great merit in a human being's ability to perceive God. And if God was so obvious...
Pause. There's great merit in a human being's ability to perceive God. Oof, that even feels nice. Okay.
Well, this is what distinguishes a great soul from an ordinary soul. If God would be openly, as visible as anything else, then how do you differentiate between this soul or that soul? You were asking about the souls who do really, really bad things and so on, and then they say, how come God allows this to happen? God will say, you have choice, and whatever you choose, that will determine whether you're close or far from God. So if you choose to do very negative karma, you'll end up very far away from God, and you have a very high price to pay. So your life isn't particularly interesting, but it's there.
So there you go. I don't know if you have ever asked yourself this question, but it's actually quite an interesting one. Would you like to be God's instrument? $1 million question, isn't it? So Sister Denise has shared what one can do in order to be God's instrument. And I think it involves cleaning up one's act, because if you are an individual who continually acts against your conscience and who's not in touch with the subtleties of your own mind and your own heart, then God will not use you. But if you gravitate towards who God is and what God is, then He will use you. But it's a very lovely way of waking up in the morning, to have a conversation with the Supreme and tell Him, today I would like to be your hands, your ears and your eyes, and do something good for one of your children or the world. It's a very noble way of living. So we thank Sister Denise for joining us. We thank you for joining us. And I do hope that if being God's instrument is on your agenda, I do wish you success in your own spiritual quest. Thank you and goodbye.